Hello, today we're going to talk about money. Since we are launching this debate on a thought for the day and the things that influence us, the things that affect us, our thoughts, philosophy, science, technology, etc. Everything at the end of the day in our lives and in our world today is controlled by money. Controlled by the financial systems, controlled by the banking systems, and no matter how hard we try, we cannot escape that. And people like myself that have gone up against the banks, in the legal systems, in the courts, it's only when you start taking those kind of steps, you realize how completely and utterly locked down we are by the banking, financial slavery system, if you want to call it that. Because ultimately that's what it is. So let's talk about this thing called money that controls our lives. Because most people are simply just not aware of what money is, where it comes from, why we use it. Is there a possibility of a different form of system other than money? But most importantly, the simple idea that we are born into a world of money, a world that is controlled by money. All of us are equally affected by this. Doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor or what country you live in. From the moment you breathe your first breath of air when you are born to the last breath of air we breathe out, everything in our lives is controlled by money and the financial system. And that is for me personally, that was a very disturbing realization to come to terms with. And I know that there are millions and millions of people out there that feel the same way. So let's analyze this thing called money. Where does it come from? Why do we use it? And is there a way out of this money system? So first of all, what we are taught at school is so far removed from the origins of money, where money comes from, that it doesn't even resemble the true origins of money. We're going to talk about the true origins of money, not where the Rothschild banking system started or the modern banking system started or where the Knights Templar started to, issue promissory notes on the way to the Holy Land and to look after the pilgrims and so forth. So there are all these different ways and different historic events that we are taught about and told about the origins of money, and the first forms of money came from here and there and so forth. Well, none of those come even close to how far back the origins of money goes to. And what is most disturbing for me is the fact that the earliest forms of money that we read about in the Sumerian clay tablets, yes, that is where we first read about money, the first banks, the first bankers, who they were, how they launched the first banks, and what kind of money they issued from their banks. And I'm going to come back to that. But what is most disturbing to me about that storyline that goes back at least 6,000 years ago, when these first banks emerged, the way that they launched money and the promissory notes, the clay tablets that were the earliest promissory notes, is exactly the same way that modern banking works today. It's all about creating bills of exchange, promissory notes, and negotiable instruments that collectively form this thing called the financial system and the banking system that controls our lives every step of the way, every second of our lives. Like I said, from the first breath we take to the last breath we breathe out, everything in our lives is controlled by money. It is unbelievable. The amount of time and energy wasted by humanity, by conscious human beings that could be doing incredible things, that could be rising and inventing and creating things that we can't even imagine, are often locked down and bogged down by the bureaucratic red tape because of the money and the financial systems. So let's talk about this thing. Where does it come from? This thing called money. Well, you'd be surprised to know that the first time we hear about money is the first time in the Sumerian clay tablets that we discover these first priest kings that mysteriously and magically appeared on earth. And pay attention here. So in human history, if you don't know about the Sumerian tablets, please go to my website, michaeltillinger.com, and there's a lot of information about that in many other videos. Go to YouTube, watch the many videos that I talk about in great detail about Sumerian clay tablets, and do your own research. In essence, the Sumerian clay tablets are these clay tablets that were created by the Sumerian scribes, from about 6,000 years ago, from the rise of the Sumerian Empire, some 4,000 BC, until they eventually withered away and disappeared. But the clay tablets were used by ancient civilizations from the Sumerians and probably before them, and these were the earliest forms of writing. So when I say Sumerian clay tablets, I mean these clay tablets, and they range from very small ones to much larger ones, and they were basically imprinted by a scribe with this written language. The Sumerians used a written language called cuneiform. Those are their letters, these little triangular wedges, kind of elongated wedge shapes that they used for their writing. And the first time we read about the bankers and the banks and creation of money is at the same time that we read about the mysterious appearance on earth by these first priest kings that simply appeared out of thin air. They appeared on earth. They seemed to have very special powers, very unusual powers like magic, if you want to call it that. They had magical powers, and they had fierce weapons, very advanced weapons and tools and technologies with which they could smite the people. Smite means hurt the people. Threaten the people first. Tell the people what they can and cannot do. And if the people don't listen and obey, they would be smited. It means they'd be hurt, decimated, or killed, or burnt, or whatever smiting might eventually turn out to be. Right? All of the above, I guess. And so these first priest kings just mysteriously appear on earth. And in the Sumerian text, they're referred to as the kings that were lowered to earth from heaven. The first kingdoms were lowered to earth from heaven when the gods appointed the first priest kings to rule over humanity. That's how mysterious the origins of money is. Pay attention to this. The Sumerians did not write this because they were bored or they had too much to drink and they made up stories like this. The Sumerians wrote millions of clay tablets in which they share advanced knowledge of medicine, astronomy, baking, making wine, how to grow crops, how to harvest crops. The Sumerian clay tablets are filled with such a rich history of what the Sumerian civilization did that it is impossible for us to imagine that they would sit and write down a bunch of crap because they wanted to confuse future civilizations. So when they tell us that there was a time when kingdom was lowered to earth from heaven, and the gods, and this is now we're talking about the Anuna gods that the Sumerians feared and obeyed and worshipped. It's very important. You cannot separate Sumerians from the Anuna gods, or the Anunnaki as they became known, and their supreme commander called Enki. So somewhere around 6,000 years ago, but it could be further back in time. It's very difficult to judge this time. So these priest kings arrived on earth. They suddenly magically appeared, and they seemed to be much larger than humans. What these priest kings then did is they built their first temples, these huge, impenetrable temples like we see all over the ancient civilizations, all over the world, where you see these big temples built out of these huge rocks that we can't seem to build today. That's what I'm referring to. So these first priest kings arrive, they have these fierce weapons, they built their temples, and from there they start to rule over humanity. And if people don't do what they're told to do, they will get smited or hurt very badly. So this is why people started to obey these first priest kings. Otherwise, why would you obey somebody if somebody told you, go over there and plow the land and give me all the food? No, you're not going to do that unless you're afraid of the individual that's giving you the orders, or you're afraid of the consequences and know that this individual has the capacity to hurt you, and you have no way of protecting yourself against that threat. So here we have suddenly these priest kings appear, they build their temples, they start to rule over the world, and people start to have to do what they are told to do, and they grow food for these priest kings, they get water for them, and at the same time they are taught a bunch of stuff. But then what these guys do next is they start to create these clay tablets in the forms of promissory notes, exactly the way our modern money works today. Promissory notes. And on these promissory notes, they wrote the following. First of all, they encouraged all the people to bring their gold and their silver to their temples, to their big temples, their forts, their castles that they built. So those were known as the temples and the dwellings of these priest kings. And from these temples, they started to issue these clay tablets, just like banks issue promissory notes. Like $100 bill is a promise to pay the bearer, on presentation, 100 pounds of silver or 100 pounds of gold and so forth. That's what old money used to be. That no longer does that. So they would encourage the people from the surrounding communities to bring in their gold and their silver to the temples, and in return these priest kings and their scribes and their bankers would give these people a piece of clay that's inscribed that that person has deposited so many nuggets of gold or so many nuggets or shekels of silver into the temple. So in essence, what we're dealing with here is the origins of the very first banks some 6,000 years ago by these mysterious priest kings that were lowered to earth from heaven, who started to control and manipulate the people, created their temples, which in essence became the first banks. And then you start to read, if you read the Ubuntu book, you realize the connection between the word banca or banco, temple, and the court, and you start seeing how this is all interconnected, that banks and courts and benches in the court and in the bank are all the same thing, because originally it came from the same place. So not only were these temples the first banks, but they were also the first places of justice, where justice was dispensed and rules and laws were made that were handed down to the people that they had to obey. Right? So now you got the court, the place of law, and the bank all under the same roof. This is very, very important, because today nothing has changed. And anyone that has gone to court to fight the banks will know exactly what I mean. And I know because I spent 3.5 years arguing against the banks in the High Courts of South Africa, only to be handed down a pre-written judgment because the banks paid the judge to read that judgment. That is a separate story that I'll cover in another food for thought later. So, before we can relieve ourselves or liberate ourselves from this economic slavery that we are all equally trapped in, we need to come to terms with the fact that money is not a noble tool. Money was not created, or money did not evolve over thousands of years to help us. That money somehow walked a long path with humanity, and we used money, and because we used money for so long, it became the tool that we're using today. Because it was useful and it helped humanity. It is exactly the opposite. Money was always created as a tool of enslavement, to entrap people, to enslave people, and it evolved into the ultimate tool of enslavement over thousands and thousands of years. The moment we come to terms with that notion and that harsh reality, it becomes a lot easier and simpler for us to start formulating thoughts and ideas and plans of action to remove ourselves from this financial slavery system. Now, I'm going to stop here, because then we're going to go, the next food for thought is going to talk about how we get ourselves out of that, and how does modern money today affect everything around us, and so many other elements and aspects of it. So let's just recap here. Money goes back thousands of years. It did not evolve. It was not created the way they teach us at school, or especially in the financial schools, where you study finance and economy and all that. That's where they sell us the lies, because they make us they have to make us believe that money is an indispensable part of life, that if it wasn't for money, there would be no progress. If it wasn't for money, we wouldn't achieve anything, that money makes the world go round, and all these nonsensical stories that we are told over and over and over again. Well, that is all a bunch of bullshit. Okay, so whatever school you go to and they start talking about this, you can put your hand up and tell the lecturer the true story and the true origins of money, and dispel this nonsensical the nonsensical lies that make us believe that we can't live without money. In fact, the next food for thought, we're going to talk about what will happen if we remove money from society. And I would like you to go away and think about it before you watch the next video that I talk about this. What happens if you remove money from society? Will society collapse? Will it affect us negatively? Are we going to have to dig ourselves out of some hole? Or does it have an opposite effect? Does it actually help society if there's no money? And so forth. And you'll be very, very surprised. Go away, do some of your own thinking, philosophize over this, think about practical ideas, think about what would happen with pioneers. And you know, in the old days when pioneers got on their horseback and their cattle cars and they went out into the wild west or the wild unknown, how did they survive? They didn't have money, they didn't have jobs, and yet they survived and they prospered. Many of these pioneer groups created incredibly powerful communities and countries, and yet they did that all without money. So let that sink in, let that be a little bit of a hint for our next meeting, where we're going to cover another interesting food for thought. I hope you enjoyed this. Until next time, this is Michael Tellinger. Bye for now.